In this episode, we're setting up procedurally generated semi-random facial animations for our Metahuman character. So we have idle animations, but we also have animations when the player takes damage, and last but not least, of course, when using abilities. Let's get to it. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and this episode is the last episode before we officially get into AI. And I debated postponing this episode because it's not really essential for what we're doing, but then I realized, we probably want to make sure all the facial animations we want for taking damage, random idle animations, for casting abilities, we probably want to make sure all those are working before we really get into AI characters. And this episode might seem really complicated at first glance because it's long and we set up a ton of functions, but really it's just a standard piece of functionality that's pretty simple once you understand it, and we're replicating that across multiple situations. Because there are really just three parts to this setup. It's like, what facial expression do you want to actually adjust? And that's going to be adjusted via something called an Anim curve. And we're going to have functions that adjust that on a tick-by-tick basis because we want our facial animations to be in real time. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, what is the mechanism that's actually going to trigger that change in the facial animation? So did our player take damage? Are they about to cast an ability? And then the third one is, where does that curve actually come from? So when you think of a curve, just think of a change of a value over time. So is it going to come from a timeline? Is it going to be an animation curve that's built directly into an animation? So we got to take that value and then pass it into our functions that we're adjusting on a tick-by-tick basis. So here are the key concepts today. I know it looks like a lot of new stuff, but it's all revolving around our Metahuman face animation blueprint. So let's get into it. All right, so we're going to start with the simplest possible curve that we're going to manipulate, and that's going to give you a sense of the big picture for doing this. And so what we're going to do is random blinking for our character. And to start, we're going to set this up on our third-person character, because although we don't have a metahuman on our third-person character currently, eventually we will. So we're going to go into our third-person character blueprint. And on our third-person character, I'm going to create a brand new function, and we're going to call it random blinking. And even though this is purely aesthetic, I'm actually going to categorize it under health because, well, a character that's blinking, that's a good sign. He's still alive. And then if we go back to our event graph, so I'm going to scroll up to begin play, and we're going to take all of our health-related stuff that we set up in previous episodes, like our health recovery and heartbeat, and then right after that, we're going to do random blinking. Connect that up. Connect this up here. And then I'm just going to comment this because these three nodes, well, they're the instantiation of a living being. Now, the way we're going to handle blinking is via timeline. So when the timeline's at 0, our player's eyes are going to be fully open. And then the timeline goes up to 1 at its peak. And that's when the player's actually blinked, not winked, blinked. And then it comes back down. And that's when the eyes open again. So let's first set up the timeline, and then we'll set up the random blinking function. Come down to my event graph. Come down, down, down. And I'm going to do it right next to our pulse that we set up a few episodes ago, because blinking and pulse, those are both health related. So, okay, we're going to right click, we're going to do a new timeline and add a timeline at the bottom here. And we're going to name this timeline blinking. And then I'll go into that and we'll add a track, a float track, and we're just going to title that blink. And the length of this is going to be very short because blinking, not a long time, 0.3 seconds. So our first point, we'll add a key at 0, so time 0, value 0, and then we'll add another point right in the middle, add a key, and that's going to be time 0.15 and a value of 1. And then one neat trick I found is that zoom to fit horizontal, that just kind of resizes the whole thing. Okay, so we can come over to the right here. We can right click over here, add a key, and this one's going to be time 0.3 and a value of 0. And then you've seen this before with timelines. We right click, we auto tangent, and that just smooths all the curves out. And this one too. All right, so there's our blink curve. So next we're going to go into our random blinking function. And what this is going to do is whenever we call this function, then it's going to play the timeline. But I want to randomize how quickly our player actually blinks, because sometimes you blink really fast. I think that was slow, but sometimes you blink fast. And sometimes it's very gentle. So the way we're going to randomize it is if I go under components here, I can get a reference to our blinking timeline. And then from our blinking timeline, we're going to set the play rate. And the play rate, we're going to randomize a little bit. So I can do a random float in a range. And that random float is going to be between 0.5 and 1.5. And then we'll connect this up. And that's going to play at either at 50% speed, so it'll be 0.6 seconds, or 1.5 times speed, anywhere in that range. Connect this up, and then we can get another reference to our blinking timeline, because then we're going to say play from start. I always like saying play from start because that ensures that if it's already on the curve, it just starts over from the beginning. Now that shouldn't happen in this case because the blink curve is only 0.3 seconds, and we're going to set this to repeat between 0.4 and 10 seconds. But how do we set it to repeat in a randomized time frame? So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer by function name. We've done this many times before in other episodes, so you should have a sense of this. So we're going to get our function name. I can just right-click rename to get our function name verbatim, paste that in, and then we'll right-click and search for random float and range, and that's going to be our time frame for when this function repeats. So it's going to be anywhere between 0.4 and 10 seconds. And connect this up. Because you got to think about it this way. I mean, sometimes you may stop blinking for a long period of time, but that's going to be pretty rare. Usually you're blinking, you're blinking, you're blinking. It's randomized, but it's usually within that time frame. So we'll compile and save this. So let's go back to our event graph because I want to talk through how this is going to work. So as soon as we begin play, it's going to start random blinking. It's going to go into this function. It's going to say set the play rate of that timeline 0.5 to 1.5 times speed, anywhere in that range. And then it's going to play that timeline. And then it's going to repeat this function anywhere from 0.4 to 10 seconds later. But our timeline, let's go to our timeline now. So our timeline isn't actually doing anything yet, right? It's not actually connected. This blink value isn't driving anything. And this is where it's going to start driving our animation curves. But here's the thing. So our Metahuman isn't on our BP third-person character at all. So we created a separate character last episode specifically for our AI adversary, and we haven't even started AI yet. And this character is a child class of our BP third-person character, but all the things that we need to manipulate our facial animation, they all live on this. But I still want to do this on the third-person character, and the reason is that any humanoid character is going to inherit from this. And the reason I'm doing it off a third-person character, and I might end up regretting this in the future, but the reason I'm doing it is because I want to be able to possess and actually steer any AI character. Now, if you're not following this series, I probably do a totally separate character class, and you don't even have to worry about it, but we're just going to do everything on the third-person character. So what I'm going to do, and you could follow along just by doing this directly on your Metahuman character, but what I'm going to do is we're going to go into our adversary AI character that we created last episode, and I'm just going to literally copy our face mesh here. I'm going to right-click, copy. I'm going to go over to our third-person character. Underneath our mesh, I'll right-click and paste. And then we have to drag it over under our mesh. There we go. And what this is going to allow us to do is then reference our face. Yeah, it's kind of, I've always wanted to reference my face. But anyway, we're going to reference our face, and that's going to allow us to update the animation on our face directly on our third-person character. But the problem is, as it currently stands, if I go over to the viewport, we now have two faces on our character. We have our actual face and then our floating head, which is interesting but a little freaky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the transform changes there, so it's just over our regular head. And then the other thing I'm going to do is just not make it visible. So we're going to hide it. So we're going to be able to manipulate it just fine, but it's not going to show up on our character. The other thing to do here, so make sure under your details panel, make sure you've got disable post-process blueprint unchecked. You need to have this post-process blueprint activated in order to get our facial animations working with everything I'm going to show you today. But the standard Metahuman already has it. It's already set up. Everything's good to go. So if you're using standard Metahuman, you should be fine. So now, like I said, we need to set up a reference to our face. So I'm going to go back to our event graph. We're going to do this the same way that we've set up other references in the past. So we got all these references up here on begin play. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit and I'll make a little bit more space here. Directly after our animation blueprint reference, that's when we're going to set up our face reference. And so to do that, I can just get a reference to our face. I can say get anim instance, and that's the instance of the animation blueprint that's being used. And then from that instance, we can cast to our face, cast to face anim. Yeah, that's a little funny. And then connect it up. And then as face anim BP, we can right click promote to variable, and I'll connect this up directly to our next reference. And this one I'm going to rename. So I'll come down here, right click, rename. This is going to be titled face anim BP ref. And I'll categorize that under our references. So over here, references. And then I can comment. So just C and then face anim BP reference. Compile and save. And the reason we have to do this is because our face mesh here, it has a completely separate animation blueprint from the rest of our skeleton. And it makes sense. Like the face is the most complicated thing in terms of expression, in terms of movement, like what's recognized by the player. So if you're looking at someone's face, you notice a lot more subtle changes in their facial structure than you do, say, their hand or their arm. Our eyes are built to recognize changes in facial structure. And that's why the face blueprint is a totally self-contained thing, because it needs to reflect the complexity that's in there. And now that we have a reference to our face, then we can get a reference to all the curve values that we need to adjust how our face is going to be reflected when, for example, a pain animation occurs, or when the player is about to cast something and you want a facial expression for that. But before we do that, let's just take a quick detour. We'll go into our animation blueprint for the face, and I'll kind of explain how the different structures work together, what we're actually going to manipulate, how that drives the facial animation, etc. So we're going to start by going to the folder with our anim class here. So we can click our folder right there. And that's going to open up our face anim BP. Open that up. And you'll see that on our event graph, there's really not much happening here. So we got on event blueprint update animation here, which is basically event tick for animation blueprints. It's basically assessing, is our live link face head activated? And only if it's activated, do something. So it's evaluating the live link frame. And if you're unfamiliar with live link, that's the app that you can download for free on your phone. And it actually measures how your face changes in real time. And then that can be recorded on your Metahuman face. So you can actually record facial animations directly from your phone, and it's all totally free. So I thought about doing that in terms of like random idle animations and stuff like that, but then I decided, I think we could do this procedurally, and by doing this procedurally, then we can have really infinite combinations of animations, and we don't have to record like a set of 50 in order to give our player that randomization. And so all the magic that we're going to do for procedural animation, it's not going to come from our event graph here, but rather our Anim graph. So let's go into that. But let's start on the back and work our way forward. So it's starting with this AR kit head rotation, and I think that's related to the live link face when you're doing it on the app. Like, is our head tilting at all? And then it's adjusting our head accordingly with the transform modify bone node here. And then if we move over here, then it's taking our body pose and it's blending that right into the head so they all match. And then we can come down here to the right, and then we have separate controls for the teeth and separate controls for the mouth, closed or open. I don't know why they have this set separately, but I think it has to do with actually manipulating the bone structure versus just the face structure. And that's just a guess on my part. But basically, this gives us our first clue as to how to manipulate the face. So if we wanted the mouth open, then we can get a curve name like jaw open or mouth close. And I don't know why they have two here, but basically they figure out the difference between the two, and then that drives the curve where that's going to actually open the jaw on our player's face. But the magical node, the truly magical node, is this get custom controls and the modify curve here. And this took me a little while to figure out, but basically what this is doing, we can double click into it to go into this pure function. It's literally just getting the values that are stored in this variable here, this custom control values. And all this variable is it's an array that contains two pieces of information. It's a name tied with a float. And the name is the name of whatever curve is being manipulated, and the float is on a scale from 0 to 1. What is that curve value right now in time? And so then you're probably wondering, well, what are the curve values? What do they actually change? What do they drive? So for that, let's go into our face archetype skeleton here. And on the right-hand side under Anim curves, you have a ton of different curves. And one thing I found, and I don't know why this is, but every single curve that we're going to manipulate, it all starts with control. And I think it has something to do with the fact that these are all attribute curves and not morph target curves. And to be honest, I have no idea what the difference are between these. I'm going to talk about morph targets, which are the traditional way of doing this, in just a little bit. But if anyone knows the difference between attribute curves and morph target curves, please let me know in the comments below. But anyway, only the control curves actually work with what we're about to do, but there's dozens of them. And with just a few of them, it's perfectly effective at getting the result that I was happy with. But basically all the control curves here, the control corresponds with our custom control values here. And so let me explain how this is working. So let's say you want our character's brows, our eyebrows, to be raised upward. So we have this lateral left and lateral right, which correspond to the left eyebrow and the right eyebrow respectively. Now this is the left because you got to remember our character is facing us. So anyway, so if I adjust the left, if I just click and drag that up, 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 up. So actually that's squashing his eyebrows a little bit. So instead I can come down to the raise in, and that's going to be the inner part of the eyebrow. And often I'm just figuring out what these are doing by just playing with them. So if we raise that, so then the inner part of his eyebrow, yeah, so we're starting to see an obvious result there. And if we do it for our right eyebrow, and so that's an easy way to get an anxious expression right there. Because what each of these curves is doing is it's taking various points on our face mesh, and then it's adjusting those in some way. So think of a curve as a way of representing a variety of points all into one curve, and based on how that curve adjusts, based on how that one value changes across time, all those points are changing accordingly. So all the parts of the skin are being pulled in one direction in this case. Or at least that's how morph targets typically work. Now again, I'm not sure what the difference is between morph targets and attributes, because when I uncheck attributes, all the control expressions disappear. But because we have all these control expressions here, what we can do is we can just feed those into the variable that lives here, and then based on all the custom control values that are stored on this variable, they are going to drive in our Anim graph all the curves that are going to be modified directly on that animation blueprint. And you might say, Neil, that's way over my head. And if that's the case, totally fine. So all we're going to do, literally all we're going to do to make this work is we have this set control function that comes with our Metahuman blueprint automatically. So if I go into that set control function, this is already doing the heavy lifting for us. Like all we need to do is call this set control function, and we need to specify, okay, what curve are we changing? That's our control name. And then what value is it going to be? And that's going to be reflected via a timeline in the case with blinking. Because at this point in the timeline, it's going to be 0, and then it's going to be 0.1, and then 0.2, and then our player is going to blink over the course of that timeline if we call this function every single tick. And as it's being called every single tick, then it's updating our anim graph in real time because this is being evaluated every single tick. So that's basically the gist of everything that we're going to do on this episode. And now it's just a matter of setting the curves that we want to set and figuring out how we want to set those curves over time. And like I said, we're going to start with blinking. So back in our third person character blueprint, now we can go down back to our timeline. And now that we have a reference to our face that we just set up, we can get our face anim BP reference, and now we just get a reference to that function. So we drag out a pin and we can say set control. And we got to specify our control name and we got to specify our value. Now the value is easy. That's going to be connected up to the blink here. And for our control name, we just got to get the control we want from our face skeleton. And for each of these curves, I literally just went through the list. I played with each one of them and I jot them down in a document figuring out, okay, these are the curves that I think will work well for pain expression. These are the ones that I think will work well for like angry expression. And that's all I did. And for blink, it was that simple. I blink L and I blink R. So what I can do here is I can right click, I can say rename curve. We're not actually going to rename, but copy, and then come back to our BP third person character, and I'll just paste that in here. And then we'll do the same exact thing again for our right eye. So I'll copy and paste that here, connect this up with our little reroute node here. I'll connect this up here, put another reroute in, and then change this to R. Connect this up here. And what I'm going to do just to make some space, I'm going to drag all this stuff down a little bit. Don't like things so squashed. Now, before we test, there's just one more thing we have to do, and you only actually have to do this if you're following along like me, meaning you have a separate metahuman character from our third-person character. And the fact that we have a separate blueprint for this means that our face anim BP ref is not going to be the same on our BP adversary AI character, because what we have to do is on this character, we have to get a reference to our face and update that ABP reference, because you'll notice that this face 0 is different than our face here. And this one is the one that we're actually using in our character. So it's very simple. So for that, I'm going to go back to our event graph. And here it has nothing on our event graph because it's inheriting everything from our third person character class. But now we got to do the same thing with reference we did earlier, but this time we got to use face 0. So face 0, I'm going to drag out, get our anim instance. We're going to cast to our face BP, face anim BP, connect this up. And then we don't need to promote this to a variable because we already have a variable that's stored on the parent, our third person character class, and that's our face anim BP ref here. And so I can just go right back and I can say set face anim BP ref. And I got to scroll down, set face anim BP ref there. Connect this up just like here and connect this up here. And all this is doing is it's updating the reference to be actually the face that's on this character. And I'm just going to comment it to that effect. So I'll drag this out and we'll do a comment. The comment's going to be links our face mesh component anim instance that's on this actor, the child actor, to the reference. So we'll compile and save this. And now we are ready to test our blinking. But before you test, just make sure you go into your game mode. So mine's under content core third person game mode here, and make sure that your metahuman character is set for your default pawn class, because it's only going to work if your metahuman character is actually being used. All right, so what we should see here is our character occasionally blinking anytime between 0.4 and 10 seconds. There we go, in 10 seconds. And it should be randomized quite a bit, because what's happening is this function's initially being called as soon as we begin play, and then it's repeating that 0.4 to 10 seconds. And when it actually gets called, then it plays the timeline and it's setting that curve value. So now let's get into some more complicated stuff. And we're going to start with our idle animations. So my idea here is to set up truly randomized procedural animation for when our player is idle. But the problem here is that there are just so many curves that we can mess with, right? Even if we narrow it down to just the control curves, there's literally like 100 different curves. So what I've done is I put together in the spreadsheet that you're used to seeing every episode, you can go into the link in the description below, see that spreadsheet. You could see the exact curves that I'm using for each thing that we're going to do the rest of this episode. But I strongly encourage you to check out these curves for yourself. You know, try manipulating each curve, seeing if you like it, seeing if it's actually going to be useful, and then you can set up your own random animations this way. So I'm going to keep our face archetype skeleton open, but I'm going to close out of our face anim BP because we're not going to need that anymore. Let's go back into our third person character. And on our third person character, to truly create that sense of randomization, I'm going to create a bunch of variables, and each of these variables is going to be responsible for a different part of randomization. And it's going to be 6 booleans and 6 floats. So I'll hit +, and this is going to be face animation random bool eyes 1, and then we'll just duplicate it, and we'll do bool's eyes 2, and we'll keep duplicating. So right click, duplicate, and then this, after eyes 2, we're going to do our upper face, and then we'll duplicate that, and then we'll do our lower face, but this one's going to have 3, so we'll start with 1, and then duplicate lower face. This one's going to be 2, duplicate one more time, and this one's going to be 3. And then we can create our first float variable. So +, face animation random float eyes 1, and this I'm going to change over to float. And what I should have done is I should have categorized these first and then duplicated, and then they'd all be under the right category. But we're going to give all of these a category of face animation, one word. What I find is that even if you have a billion variables on a blueprint, it really doesn't hurt anything if they're well categorized. So strongly encourage you guys to categorize. All right, so now we got our random float eyes. So now we can right click, we can duplicate that. It's going to be eyes 2, and you'll see that it's still categorized under face animation here. We'll right click, duplicate again. Go to float upper face, right click, duplicate again. We're going to do lower face 1, and you know the drill. 2 more times, lower face 2, and last time, lower face 3. And each of these float values is going to drive a corresponding curve. And so now we're going to create a series of functions that are going to randomize the eyes, randomize the upper face, and randomize the lower face. And these functions will be called every tick when we're doing a facial animation via a timeline, just like you see here. So let's start by creating a brand new function. So I'll do plus sign. This is going to be called face animation random idle eyes. And then I'll go back to our event graph, because what we're going to do is we're going to copy both of these, and I'm going to paste them into that function. And we need a function input, and this is going to be our curve value. So I'm just going to hit plus sign for input, and I'll call this curve value, and I'll make this into a float. And that's what's going to be connected up to here and to here. But so that we're not drawing spaghetti all over the place, I'm just going to make some space here. I'll promote it to a local variable, and down here under our local variables, I'll right click rename, and I'll call it our local curve value. Now we need to come up with the most efficient way of doing this for a lot of different curves. And with most of these curves, you'll notice that the curve name is exactly the same, but then there's just an L or an R on the side of it. So why don't we create a single function that could sort of be nested inside these other functions? And that single function will just append L or R onto the end of whatever curve name we pass into it. So it's just an easy way of simplifying that double logic into one function. But first, let's set up the logic that we actually want it to do. So we'll take our local curve value, and that's going to be connected up to each of these value pins here. And then for the control name, so I noticed that you can't append a letter onto a name, but you can a string. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a literal string to start. So make literal string. And from that, I can drag out a pin, and I can say append. And usually I do this with print strings, but now we're actually going to append a letter, L. And then from here, I can connect this up directly to the control name, and it automatically translates our string into a name. And I can do the same exact thing for our second node. So I'll paste that down below, and this one's going to append R. And then I can connect this directly to here. But then we don't want these animations to be the same every single time, do we? So that's where we're going to use the variables that we just created. And so I'm just going to take one example of these. So our face animation random float eyes, and I'll pull that in. And then I'm just going to make a little bit more space, because I'm going to drag out our local curve value a little bit, and we're going to multiply these two together. Because what we're going to do is we're going to adjust our curve value based on like a timeline curve, but we're going to adjust that at a randomized rate based on these variables here. So I'll connect this up here, and then this is what's going to be connected up to our controls. We want to make sure the left side and the right side are both identical, because if our left eye moves this way and our right eye moves that way, it's not good. And actually, there's one more thing I can do to simplify. So this is going to be connected up here, because it's going to be the same exact make literal string for both. So I'm going to drag both of these out below, because everything else, so these three are going to be outside the function, but everything else is going to be collapsed into a function. So we'll select all of this, and then right click, and then collapse to function. And this function is going to be titled, if we right click, rename, update, left and right facial animation. And let's go into that, because we got to rename these inputs a little bit. So first I'm going to move this over, move this up. So the A, instead of A, this is going to be titled left. And then A2, this is going to be right. A3, this is our actual curve value. And then B, this is our random constant float. And I say constant because what we're going to do is we're going to set each of these float values before the timeline even gets called. And this is going to be a constant value during the timeline. Basically, you want the randomization to occur, not every single tick, but when the timeline just starts playing. And so before we go any further and we start duplicating functions, let's just classify these two. Categorize this one under face animation, and our second one also under face animation. All right, let's go back to our random idle eyes. So we got our function now for updating both sides of the face. So now all we need to do is pass in whatever curves we want to update. But here's where our random booleans come in, because I want the curves to be different depending on whether the boolean is true or false. So that's going to give it some randomization each and every time we go into one of these random animations. So we'll get our first random bool eyes 1, get, and then we'll connect that up to a branch. Connect this up here. And so the literal string that we're going to use for this first one, it's control expressions I look down. And again, just consult the spreadsheet below and you'll see all of these. And if this is true, we'll update this one. And if it's false, well, we could just replicate this entire thing and we'll just use a different curve value. So that one's going to be look up. So either we're looking up or we're looking down, and then connect up false to that. I'll put in a reroute node there. So then we get to our second Boolean. So we can drag in a reference to that, get, and I'll connect that one up to a branch. Connect this up here, connect this up here, because both of these are going to connect up to a second Boolean that we evaluate a second curve. So we're determining here, are we going to look up or down at random? But now we're going to determine whether we look to the left or to the right at random. So I can copy both of these, paste them in, connect up true here, connect up false there, add a reroute, rearrange slightly. So instead of random float eyes 1, don't forget this step. We got to use random float eyes 2 because we're going to have a different randomized float value for these curves. And then we'll also copy and paste that down here. And so these are just going to be, instead of look down, it's going to be look left and look right. I think case sensitive does matter here, so make sure you get it verbatim. And again, we're just referring to the curves that are right here. So now before we get this working for the rest of the face, let's just test it out for the eyes. And let's work our way backwards. So how do we call this function? And we need to call it every single tick because our eye position is going to be updated every single tick. And so that means a timeline. So let's go back to our event graph. And for this, instead of up here, I'm just going to start doing these all down here at the bottom. So right click, we're going to do a new timeline all the way at the bottom, add a timeline, call this one random idle face animation. Because this is going to drive all three of our functions that we end up creating. One for eyes, upper face, and lower face. And we'll go into that. And we're going to do a 2-second curve. So length 2 seconds. We'll rename the track. And I'm just going to title it curve value. We'll do the same kind of thing. Add a key there. Add a key to the middle at 1 second. Add a key to the end. And I just adjust the time right up here. And this one in the middle at time 1 second is going to be a value of 0.5 because I don't want these idle animations to be so exaggerated. When the curve value goes all the way to 1, it's usually pretty exaggerated. I just want them to be subtle when the character is idling, just enough that it feels real. So we'll right click here, auto, and we'll also auto tangent this one. Compile and save. We'll go back to our event graph, and then we can just connect up our face animation function, face animation random idle eyes, and connect it up to the curve value here. So we started all the way at the end of the chain events with these functions here that are going to be called every single tick. And then the timeline is what's actually going to call them every single tick. But what do we actually need to call the timeline? So we only want these facial animations to play when our player's idling, right? And so the idling is going to be driven off of our animation blueprint. So we need to do something on our regular animation blueprint to actually call this timeline when the player's in the idle animation. So we could have like a start event or an end event, or we could have a series of anim notifies all throughout the idle animation. But I don't think I want to do that because that's still not going to randomize whenever it happens. My idea instead is we're going to set up a curve value of 1 across the entire idle animation. And then on a per tick basis in the anim BP, it's just assessing, okay, is that curve value 1? And if it is, that means our idle animation's playing. And then if our idle animation's playing, there can be some chance, like maybe it's like a 1% chance every tick that it goes into one of these randomized animations. I think it'll make sense once we build it. So let's go over to our animation blueprint. I'm just going to compile and save this first. And then we can go over to our actual mesh here, and we can go into our ABP here. So I'll just open that up. And for this, we have to go into our locomotion state machine because that's where our idle animation is. So I'll go to my anim graph, actually under anim graph, locomotion, idle here. And here's our idle. And a few episodes ago, we set up our damaged idle state. We're also going to do that this episode. So let's go into idle first. So I'll pause this. So we got a regular idle animation here. And we've done this in previous episodes, but if you haven't done this before, it's very easy to add a curve to an animation. So right under here, we'll say add curve, create a curve, and I'll call it random idle face animation. And then we can select curve again, say edit curve, and I'm just going to add a single key to this curve, and that's going to have a value of 1. So the entire animation that has a value of 1. And this way, the curve is only going to play during an idle animation. And so it's not going to occur at any other time when our player's animated other than when the player's idling. And so now we can exit out of this. We can go back to our animation blueprint and specifically the event graph. And so now we're going to assess something on a per tick basis to assess whether or not we should call that timeline. So we're going to do a new function over here. I'm going to call it assess idle animation. And before we worry about what that function is actually doing, let's go back to our event graph. And although you probably don't have all this stuff if you're not following along with this series, that's okay. You just need to find this node right here, and anywhere on this node, anywhere in this sequence, you can just plug in a reference to our function. And that just means it's going to be assessed every single tick. And so now let's go into that function and set it up. So we need to set up logic that's going to assess, should we randomize facial animations this tick? And there's a few criteria that need to be met in order for that to happen. And the first criteria is that curve value that we just set up on the idle animation. So we need to get a curve value, get curve value. And our curve name was random idle face animation. Make sure you get this verbatim. Very easy to mess that up. And if that curve equals 1, so equals and then 1, then we know our idle animation is playing. But then there's going to be a couple other criteria that need to be met in order for this idle animation to play. So I'm going to do an and statement here. And so the question is, how often do we want these random facial animations to occur? And I'm thinking anywhere from like every 0.5 to 1 second to every like 5 seconds, something like that. It should be pretty frequent. And so my way of doing this is very simple. We'll do a random float in range. I love this node, random float in range. It's just so useful. So the minimum is 0, the max is 1. And if this value is greater than, let's do greater than 0.99. So 99% of the time it's going to be false, which means 99 out of 100 ticks it'll be false, but that 1 out of 100 tick it's going to be true, and then it'll do a facial animation. So that's like every 2 seconds basically it's going to be true if you're thinking like 50, 60 ticks a second. Now there's one last criteria, and this I only got through testing, which is if our idle animation timeline is already going, the player's already in an idle animation, then we don't want to call it again because it'll just interrupt whatever's going on, right? So we can get a reference to our third person character, and then from there we can get a reference to our timeline, the random idle face timeline, face animation timeline, and we can check from this, is it currently playing? And only if it's not playing. So not this not equal, I always select that, not Boolean there. And then we can connect it up to the and here. So these 3 criteria all have to be met. So this first one is if idle animation curve is active. And this second criteria is, and then this third criteria, and the timeline is not already currently playing. Then from this, then we can branch. Connect this up to our assess idle animation here. And then from this, if all 3 of those criteria are true, then we can play our timeline. So for that, I'll get a reference to our third person character again, get a reference to our random face animation, random idle face animation timeline. And just like we did for our blinking, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the play rate and I'm going to randomize the play rate just a bit. So if all these are true, then the play rate is going to be a random float in a range. And it's going to be 0.5 to 1.5. Because we also want to randomize these facial expressions in terms of how quickly the face actually moves. And then we can get another reference to this and say play from start and connect this up. But there's one last piece of setup that we need. So I'll compile and save this. Can you guess what it is? So we never actually set at random what these random bools are and what these random floats are. So for that, we're going to create one more function on our third person character here that's going to set each time the timeline's called, it's going to set what those randomized values should be. So we'll come up here, we'll create a new function. This is going to be titled face animation set random values. And I'm going to categorize this one also under face animation. Now we need to set a whole bunch of values. Luckily, we only need to do this once in this function. It's pretty simple, but it's just a lot of variables. So what I'm going to do to make this easier is we're going to do a sequence node. So a sequence just allows us to execute multiple things top down instead of left to right in an execution pin style. And we are setting 12 different variables. So this is going to go from 0 to 11. Add pin, add pin, add pin, add pin. And we got to drag in a reference to each one of these. So just start with our bools first. So we can right click from here and say random bool. And the random bool is going to be connected up to each and every one of these. And that function is going to be called for each individual execution pin, which means each one will be an independent random bool. And I can just line these up very close together and connect all these up. All right, halfway there. And for this, we could do a random float again in a range, 0 to 1, and connect them up. Voila, complete. If you got all that, compile and save. And the last thing is back in our animation blueprint, we have to call this function. So we'll come back to our assess idle animation function. And what I can do is from our third person character here, we can just get a reference to our function, face animation set random values. And we're going to do that right before we call the timeline because we want those values to be randomized right before the timeline starts playing. So let's compile and save, and we are ready to test this. And by the way, if this does not work for you, what I recommend doing is to print strings at every step in the process until you figure out what's not being called. And what we should see here, if I did everything right, this player's eyes should move to the left, should move to the right, and it should be, yep, move up, move down, a little bit randomized to and fro, and he blinks. And the eye moving should also be randomized at a different speed depending on how quickly that timeline's playing based on that set play rate. And so now it's just a matter of replicating this functionality again and again for all the different curves that we want. But we already did the heavy lifting just in terms of the foundational function structure that we need to call. So the rest of this episode should be easy pickings. But we get our first error the moment we get out of play mode, which is access none trinary property random idle face animation, branch assess idle animation. So let's go back into that function. So this error is occurring because we're trying to get a curve value before the animation curve is even valid, because animations are processed at the end of a tick and not at the beginning. So this function is occurring even before the animation's playing. And there's a really easy fix for this. So all we need to do is create some more space here, and we can right click, we can get our active curve names. And then from our out names here, we can just say, does it contain an item? And the item we're assessing is the same as the curve that we set up on the idle animation, which is our random idle face animation. Random idle face animation. Make sure you get that exactly verbatim. And then we can branch from that, connect this up, and then only if that's true does it assess this branch. We'll compile and save that. And we did have one other issue, which is if you notice the face eyes, they move a lot to one side or the other. And so I just want to reduce the amount that they're going to move. And that's a really easy fix. So we'll go back to our third person character and we'll go into our face animation, random idle eyes here, come up to the front of it. And all I'm going to do for this local curve value, I'm just going to divide here by 4. And that's going to cut the maximum of our curve at any given time from 1 down to 0.25. So our eyes in general will move like 15 degrees in any direction inside our skull versus like 75 degrees or 60 degrees, which looks kind of weird, kind of shifty. So we'll just divide this by 4, and then we'll connect this up to the local curve value here. And you could test this out, but for the sake of time, we're just going to move forward. So now all that's left is we got to randomize the rest of the face. And don't worry, all this, it's going to take time, but it's a lot easier than everything we already did. So for the upper face, let's start by duplicating our random idle eyes function. So I'll right click and duplicate, and I'll name it random idle upper face. And for this, I'm going to get rid of the divide by 4 here. It's just going to be connected right up to the local curve value. And we also got to update our Boolean here. So we'll delete this out and we'll use our upper face Boolean. And then I'll delete out the second half of this because we only have one randomization that we're doing here. And that curve value is just going to be control expressions brow down. And this bottom one is going to be control expressions brow raise outer. And we'll delete out our float eyes here because we're going to use our float upper face. And the same thing for the bottom. Compile and save that. And then back in our event graph, we just got to update our timeline. So we could drag out a pin from this and we could do face animation, random idle, upper face, and connect up our curve value. I'll just add a reroute node right down here. So compile and save here, and we are ready to test our upper face. So now we'll notice that the eyes are moving a lot less, right? So we got our eyebrows moving a little bit. Lower face is still not animated at all. That's our last one. So same kind of thing. We're going to start by duplicating our face animation, random idle eyes. This is going to be idle lower face. And instead of dividing by 4 here, we're going to divide by 2. Not 20, 2. So we got to switch out all of our bools and all of our float values. So delete this one. We're going to get our lower face 1. Connect this up. These 2, delete out our floats, lower face 1. Delete out our random bool eyes 2 here. This is going to be our lower face 2. Same thing for our floats. All right, then we need to replicate all of this because we got to do it a third time. We have a third bool for this. And you're going to see how this all comes together. So we'll get our random bool lower face 3. And over here, switch out with the third float. And now we just need to update our curve values. So let's come over here to the left. And our first curve is going to be cheek blow. And the second one's going to be mouth cheek suck. So it's going to be either or. Over to our next one. Next one's going to be corner depress. So corner down. And this one's going to be corner up. And then if we go down to this one, so I can actually delete out this pin because it's going to do nothing if this is false. And this last one's going to be corner pull. Compile and save, and now we have a comprehensive face. So I'm seeing his upper face moving, but not his lower face, and that's because what did I forget? We forgot to call the function in the timeline. So if you notice that happening, that just means we created our function, but we didn't do it on the timeline itself. So from here, of course, we got to get a reference to our face animation, random idle, lower face. Connect this up, add one last reroute, and now we are truly ready. Compile and save. Yeah, so you see some very subtle expressions, but when you're in that idle state, I think it makes sense to keep things pretty subtle. But you could always increase those curve values if you want them to be increased. So now we have a few more to set up, and our first one's going to be when taking damage. So let's do it the same way we've been doing the others. So we'll start by duplicating a function, and we'll duplicate the upper face function here. So duplicate, and this is going to have a different name. So face animation took damage. And then we're going to update a bunch of things here. We're going to delete out our branch node. We don't need that because we're going to have the same kind of facial expression every time we take damage. And then I'll delete out this bottom portion, and then I'll move this over a little bit and connect it up. Now the random constant float that we're passing into this function to update the curve values, that's going to be based on how much damage we actually took in the moment. So what I'm going to do is delete this out. In a few episodes ago, I think it was episode 43, but we started our damage system in episode 42. We created a new variable specifically for our damage taken. So that's under received damage here. So I can drag in damage taken, and then I'll drag out a pin from that and we'll divide, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare it to our current health, and that variable is underneath health here. So drag in our current health and then connect this up, because that ratio is going to determine how significant that curve should be. And this ratio I think I'm going to use a lot in the future, so I'm just going to collapse it to a macro. So I'll right click, collapse to macro. I'm just going to title this damage taken to current health ratio, and I'll categorize that one under health. And so our first literal string here, this one's going to be mouth funnel up, or U, and we just need to replicate this a few more times, set a bunch of other strings, connect this up. Next one's going to be mouth funnel D, and that's going to be our lower lip, whereas this one's our upper lip. And then I can copy both of these and we'll paste two more. This one's going to be nose wrinkle, nose, and then capital W. And the next one's going to be brow raise outer, lowercase b, capital R, capital O. And one thing I forgot, we're actually going to multiply the local curve value by a multiplier. We're going to make the effect larger. And so we're going to start by multiplying the very first one, and this is going to be 5, and connect this up. And you got to think of it this way, like when we're taking damage, we want the facial expression to be really emphasized. All right, so this one, we'll copy that, make some more space here. This one's also going to be multiplied by 5. For the nose wrinkle, same thing. So make some space here, multiply by 5. Now for the brow raise, this one is going to be multiplied by 3. So local curve value, multiply it by 3. Connect this up. Now we're going to copy this one, paste it after, and we're going to do another curve here. This is also going to be multiplied by 3, so we don't need to change that, but we're going to change the string to eye widen. So when we're taking damage, our eyes are going to, and then one more after this, we're also going to multiply it by 3, and this one's going to be brow lateral. And then the last one, so this last one is kind of strange. So we're going to paste it again, connect it up. And this one's going to be brows raise in, and that's going to be the interior of the eyebrow going up. And so my vision for that is that at any given time, how much those eyebrows are raised in the interior, that's going to reflect our current health to our max health ratio. So that's going to be an ongoing curve, not just when the player's damaged, but just in that damaged state. And the way I'm thinking about this is in terms of anxiety of the character. Like the more anxious they are, the more their eyebrows are raised, the more hurt they are, it's the same thing. And so for that one, instead of this, I'm going to delete this out. We're going to get our current health ratio. And from our curve value, I'm just going to do a minus, and it's going to be 1 minus our current health ratio, because the lower this is, the higher the curve value is going to be. In our current health ratio, again, we set this up in episode 42, but that's just our current health divided by our max health. So if our player's at 50% health, this will be 0.5. And then for the random constant float here, I'm going to get rid of this. Instead, we're just going to do a random float in range. And this might be strange because this is going to be called every single tick, so it's going to vary every single tick, but I'm just going to vary it very slightly, because if you vary this more than just this, you're going to see some weird stuff with the eyebrows. But with this subtle amount, it is varying, but you don't even notice it on the screen. It's so subtle. And then after this, we're still doing 2 other things, but these are both for our jaw. And because the jaw, it's not left and right, it's just one thing, we don't need to update the left and right. So for that, we're just going to get a reference to our face Anim BP. So I can go down to the bottom, get a reference to it, get, and we can set a control, just like we initially did with our blinks. And for that, the control name is going to be control expressions jaw FWD for forward. And we're going to once again get our damage taken to current health ratio, and that's going to drive the value here. And that's our jaw forward, but it's not our jaw open. So that's like, so we're going to do the same kind of thing with our jaw open. So I'll paste that over here, connect this up, and that one's going to be jaw open. But instead of this, we're doing something a little bit more sophisticated. So we're getting our current health ratio. And from that, we're going to do a minus. But actually, we'll connect it up to the bottom pin because the top pin is going to be 1. So this is, again, going to get the reverse ratio of our current health. And I'm going to divide this by 2 just to reduce the effect that this is going to have, because otherwise the jaw is going to be open entirely. But then here, we'll get our local curve value. So local curve value. And then we'll divide this by 3. If you're wondering where I got this math from, it was from a lot of playing with the numbers. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the jaw to move slightly, but still be open continuously based on our current health ratio. So this is basically adding these two things, like what's our current health ratio, but then the curve value, as it changes over time, the jaw will move slightly. So I'll add these two, connect this up, make a little bit more space here, and connect this up here. And I'll just move this in. So compile and save, and now we just have to set up a timeline for this. And I'm going to close out of some of these functions. We're not going to need most of this stuff. So I'll do it right underneath our random idle face animation here. So we'll right click, search for timeline, come down underneath, add timeline, name it took damage face animation. Double click to go into that. In the length, we're going to make it 2. We'll add a float track, and this one's going to be a little bit weird, but I'll explain it. So right click, add a key. That of course is going to be 0. We're going to right click again, add about 0.25. We're going to add another key, and that one we're going to move all the way to 1. So you got to think of it this way. Our player gets injured, and within about a quarter of a second they go, ah, like they get the reaction right then and there. So this goes to 1. And back in episode 43, when we set up the post-process effect for damage taken, so that damage taken is just being reduced by 10% every single tick. And so because of that, I don't actually need to reduce this timeline curve here. It's going to be reduced automatically with that damage taken variable. So what I'm going to do is right about at 1.55, something like that, I'm going to add a key there. I'm going to set our value to about 0.9. And then finally at time 2, we'll just add one final key, set our value to 0, time 2. And then we just auto tangent all of this. Auto, over here, auto. And that's going way up, so I'm just going to lower the tangent down slightly, just like that. And we'll auto the bottom as well. So if it's something like that, that's looking good. I'm just going to lower this one down also. So now back in our event graph, now that we got our timeline, we can call our function. So we can look at face animation took damage. Oh, I forgot to name my track, so we'll go back into that. We'll rename the track. We'll call it damage reaction. Back in our event graph, then we can connect this up and compile and save. I'm noticing that having the face archetype skeleton is slowing down my system, so if that's happening to you, just exit out of this. And we can also exit out of our adversary AI character. So now that we got our timeline, we got our function, we just need to call the timeline whenever we take damage. And we set that up initially in episode 42. We have an any damage event that we set up. And so I'll just come over here to the right, and right after the took damage sound effect, right there, I'm going to make some space. So we'll drag out all of these functions, move them all out, make this comment a little bit larger. Actually, I'll probably move them a little bit more. So much space. So we're going to right click. We're going to search for our took damage face animation timeline. Then from here, we're going to once again set the play rate. And for the play rate, I'm just going to randomize this completely because we don't want every single hit to have the same reaction time. I love randomizing things. It's just such an easy way to give your game that sense of unpredictability. Every time it's a little bit different. And we're going to do this one from, let's do 0.8 to 1.5. So not too fast. We get another reference to our took damage face animation, and this time we can play from start and connect it up. Now you could test this out like I have in previous episodes, like drop your character from a high height, but I'd rather set up an easier way to test it. So let's just do a keyboard P for pain. Let's do like keyboard and then search for a letter P, and then we'll pass some damage into our character. I hope he forgives us, and we'll go from there. So from this, we could just say apply damage, and our damaged actor, we can just get a reference to ourself. In the base damage, maybe I do like a random float here just for testing, random float and range, connect this up, and the random float and range will do between like 2 and 50. And our character has 100 health, so up to 50% of his health. And then what I'll do just to see that this is working, I'll do a print string. From the print string, you know this trick, I do an append, and the append could be like damage taken, and the B in the append could just be our float value right there. And then I'll drag this, not like that, drag this one down here. Drag this there, and this is all temporary. This is just to see what's happening when we press P. So compile and save, and now we can test our damage. Okay, our character here, he's hunky-dory, everything's fine. He's got some random facial animations, very casual. And now let's press P. Ah. P again. Ah. Yeah, that was a big one. And you see that gives him that anxious sense, right? But there's still a problem here because the facial animations are not updating based on our player's health going back up. So let's actually create a function just for our jaw and our eyebrows, inner eyebrows going up, and we can call that in the function that raises our player's health slowly over time, basically the heartbeat, and that way it'll automatically adjust based on our player's current health. For the sake of time, because I know this episode is pretty long, I'm just going to walk through what I did to set that up, and then feel free to copy all of this. So from our face animation took damage function, I ended up collapsing both of these two nodes into a new function, and I named that function face animation update based on damage. And then that function is being called from the took damage function right here. And I wanted to set it so that both of these update as the player regains health. So back in episode 42, we created a new function that slowly increments our player's health over time, so long as they're not damaged. And that's under health and then this increment health recovery here. And so all I did here is I made some space after the set scalar parameter value that we did in episode 43, and then we have our face animation update based on damage. And this is the entirety of the function. But next I had to figure out what I wanted to have happen with the jaw, because I don't want the player's jaw to be completely static from moment to moment. Like, I want the jaw to be moving up and down slightly, but then slowly closing as the player gets closer back up to their full health. And so what I did for that, to adjust the jaw open and close slightly, we created a new timeline for that. It just made sense to do a new timeline. And so I put that timeline right next to the took damage face animation timeline. And here's that timeline. So all it does is it goes up to 0.2 at 1 second and then back down to 0 at 2 seconds. And I made this a maximum of 0.2 because I don't want the jaw adjusting that much. I don't want the player going. And then lastly, if I go back to the event graph, you'll notice I have another function for face animation jaw open based on damage. And so let's go into that. So if you recall back in our took damage function, all we're doing there is we're getting our local curve value, dividing by 3, and we're adding that based on our current health ratio, and that's controlling how much it opens when we actually take damage. So this is actually opening quite a bit. And then in the face animation jaw open based on damage, so we're doing kind of the same thing, but we're just passing in the curve value that's directly from the timeline, and we're adding it to this chain here. Now, the only issue I ran into in this setup is when the character transitions from being damaged into that ongoing damage state. So when the character switches from the took damage face animation over to this one, because I don't want the jaw to suddenly adjust if it switches from playing one timeline into another. And so for that, what I did is, so if I go back into this, so remember that this is calling the face animation update based on damage. And then the last thing we have in this function is I first check to see, okay, are either of those timelines playing? So are either of the timelines that are adjusting the jaw up and down, are either of those playing? And if either of them are playing, then it does nothing. And only if neither of those timelines are playing, then it goes into the damage state jaw animation. So this is setting a random play rate and then playing this from the start, this right here. All right, compile and save. And then let's test it out. All right, so hit P. So damage taken 4, not that much. And our mouth opens and closes just a little bit. P again. Oh, that was a lot of damage, 30.22. Yeah, so now his mouth opens and closes slightly, and that's a variable rate over time because we randomized how fast that timeline plays. Again, see, that was a lot of damage right there. And eventually it goes back to normal. So if you have other ideas on how to improve our facial expressions, please let me know in the comments below. And the last thing before we move on is let's go back into our event graph of our third-person character, and I'm going to delete out the P. We won't need that anymore. So for our last type of facial animation we're going to set up this episode, we're going to set it up when our player is using abilities, but not just any kind of ability, but specifically offensive abilities. And we've set up 2 of those abilities so far in this series. We have a flamethrower and we also have a fireball. And whenever we have a regular animation for our player's body that we want to tie to a facial expression, it just makes sense to do it off of an animation curve because we can build that directly into the animation itself instead of having to have a separate timeline for it. And luckily for both the flamethrower and the fireball episode, if you've been following along already in this series, you already have the curve that we need. And let me show you that. So back in our ABP third-person character blueprint, I'm going to go over to my Anim graph here, and specifically into the spellcasting standing still state machine that we set up. And we'll go over to the begin animation. This was episode 27 if you want to go back and check it out. And this right here. So this is the start of the animation as our player is casting a flamethrower. And we set up this effect intensity curve on that episode because that's how the sound of the flamethrower actually ramps up as our player goes into the animation. And to see that curve, I can just go here and say edit curve. And we also did the same exact thing on our fireball episode. So for that, I'm going to go back to content and then over to our characters, over to mannequins, animations, Manny, Mixamo, and the one-handed side throw. So we did the same thing with our fireball. We have this curve here. If we see the curve, it ramps up to about there. That's when it's loudest, and then it ramps down. And we named the curve the same in both cases, effect intensity, because then we can use that effect intensity to drive all sorts of things. And that's exactly what we're going to do with the facial animation. But I'm going to go ahead and pause this because there's one thing that we need to adjust to get this this working properly. And that is the curve here, the start point and the end point. Instead of making it start at 0, 0, we want the value, the second number here, to at least be somewhat of a positive number. So even like 0.01, totally fine. So we're just raising that up slightly. And this one too, this key as well, we're going to set it to 0.01. And the reason for that is we're going to use this curve as the driving factor that's actually going to cause our facial animation. The problem is if the curve is 0 at that initial tick, then our player's facial animation is not going to occur because the curve's not actually going to be active. Any curves with a value of 0 are not considered active. And this took a bunch of troubleshooting, but it's just good to know. My recommendation there is just start your curves at 0.01, and if it's a sound or something, you're not even going to notice it. It's still going to ramp up just fine. And so we'll go back to our animation blueprint. I'm going to do the same exact thing with the start animation here. So we'll select our curve, go to edit curve, just change this one to 0.01 instead of negative 0.0, 0.01, and then save that. All right, so now the way we're going to start this is, once again, as we've been doing, we're going to duplicate a function on our third person character. So I'm going to take our face animation took damage, we're going to right click, we're going to duplicate that. And I'm going to title this face animation offensive ability. So we're only going to use this for offensive abilities, so abilities where we're actually attacking. And I'm going to start by coming down here to the right. We can just delete out this that we just set up for damage. And then I'm going to zoom out. We're going to cut everything but the first 3 here. So we're going to cut all of these and zoom in, and we can also cut out the multipliers. So we're just going to hook up directly our local curve values and one more. And then last but not least, we're going to cut out our damage taken to current health ratio. And instead, what we're going to do is a random float in range, my favorite. And this is actually going to cause the variation from tick to tick, but it's going to be so small, it's going to be imperceptible. Maybe unconsciously, you'll notice that his lips are slightly jiggling. So we'll copy that. We're going to do that for the other 2 functions. Delete out this one and there. And so in addition to funnel U and funnel down and nose wrinkle, there's 2 more that we're going to do. So I'm going to copy both of these, paste them onto the very end, and then connect this up. And the first one is going to be brow down. So control expressions brow down. Make sure you got capitalizations correct. And then the second one is going to be brow lateral, just like that, brow lateral. But now we need to call this function on whatever mechanism is going to start this spell, right? So whatever mechanism is actually going to trigger that animation, then we want to call this function. So I'm going to compile and save this. And for that, I'm going to go into our gameplay ability blueprints. So I'll go back to content, blueprints, and gameplay abilities. And these we started in episode 26. And we have to go into our gameplay ability fire because it's actually our fire abilities that so far are the offensive abilities. So if I zoom out here, so the event that's actually causing this to start is this activate fire ability event. And we don't need to do it for display only because that's the torchlight effect, but we do need to do it for single cast, which is our fireball, and channel. So if I come down to the end of our single cast chain here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a reference to our third person character, get third person character reference, and we are going to call that function. So face animation offensive spell or offensive ability. Connect it up. And so now the question is, where is the curve value coming from? Well, it's coming from the animation, right? So for that, we can get a reference to our animation blueprint. So ABP, get ABP third person character reference. And then from that, we can get a curve value. And it's only going to work if our curve value is not 0. And that's why we set it up to be not 0. And the curve is going to be titled effect intensity, if I could spell. There we go. And connect this up. But actually, this isn't going to work as it currently stands, because what we really need to do is we need to call this function every tick while the animation's active. And as it currently stands, it's only going to be called once whenever our fire ability is actually activated. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to collapse it to a function. But before we collapse it to a function, I want to make this generally available to all of our gameplay abilities, not just fire, because we are going to have other offensive abilities for other types of gameplay abilities. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open up the parent gameplay ability blueprint. And from here, I can create a brand new function. And this one, I'm going to call face animation trigger for offensive ability. And for this function, I can go back into our gameplay ability fire. And this is where I can copy all of this, come back into our gameplay ability blueprint, just paste it in. But before I connect it up, the way this is going to work is it's going to be called every tick so long as this curve is active. So we got to make sure that this curve is active before it actually does this. So what we're going to do is get another reference to our ABP third person character. And we're going to get our active curve names. And that's going to return an array of all of our active curves on our animation blueprint. And then specifically from this, we can just say, does it contain a particular curve? And what curve should it contain? Well, that's our effect intensity. I'm just going to move this over a little bit, because if our effect intensity is contained within the active curves, then we want to go ahead with this function. So then we'll connect this up here. And so long as it is active, then we're going to call this function the next tick. So we can do a set timer by function. Set timer by function. And that's what's going to keep it going until the curve actually stops being active. So set timer for next tick by function name. And we can right click, get the exact name by rename, Control-C to copy, and then paste it in here. And then if it's not active, well, let's clear our timer by function name. So clear timer by function name. And again, we can just rename, Control-C copy, paste that in. So we'll compile and save this on our overall game playability blueprint, but now we have to call this function on whatever offensive abilities are going to look at that curve. And so for that, we'll go back to our gameplay ability fire, and we'll delete out this right here. And initially, I just did this. Initially, I just did face animation trigger for offensive ability, and I thought, oh, that's going to work great. But the problem is in the same tick where we're triggering the animation to begin, and that's happening in this same tick that all this is being executed, because what we're doing is we're starting to play the montage in this tick. In that same tick where it's just being triggered, the curve is not yet active. It's active in the subsequent tick. And so what I found I needed to do is instead of this, we just need to call timer by function next tick, and that way it'll start playing immediately next tick. So I'm going to delete this out here, drag out a pin. We're going to do set timer for next tick by function name. We've been doing this a lot lately, but I find it works fantastic. So face animation trigger for offensive ability. So whatever you name the function, just make sure you got it verbatim. And what you could do is you could actually copy it from over here because it's really the same thing, and then paste that over here. Okay, so once we've copied that here, I'm just going to do that. So we've got it for our fireball, which is our top one here. This is the fireball montage. But then we've got our lower part, which is our flamethrower. I'm just going to paste it right there. Connect this up. And compile and save this. And by the way, if you're not following along with my gameplay ability system, you could still do this. What I would do is I'd set up Anim notifies on your animation blueprint itself, and those Anim notifies could be triggered as soon as the animation starts, and that would be the mechanism that gets it going. And even with an Anim notify, you could do it with a curve so that it kind of scales in the animation. So if you made sure to update all of your curves so that they start at 0.01, the next tick, then that should be detected. So we're ready to test. So I'm going to exit out of this, and if everything's compiled and saved, here we go. All right, I got all my abilities, and so if we set this up properly, then what you saw in the intro should work now. So I'm going to use my flamethrower. Here we go. Yeah, that's either a constipated or very angry face. And then he's back to normal. Let's try it for a fireball. Ready? Yeah, it's just a quick snarl, right back to normal. The other thing you could test is get him damaged a little bit and then use the abilities and see how the animations, the facial animations, blend together. All right, so now he is really damaged. So let's see how this goes. Still looks kind of angry, but also not so happy. So that concludes our episode for today. And in our next episode, we're finally working with AI and behavior trees. Just the start, just the start. So I hope to see you there.